Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Daily Maverick webinar. I'm Neesa Moodley, your host, editor at Business Maverick. And with me today, I've got Joshua Kadish, co-founder and director at Sourcefin, and Dr. Shaheem Patel, academic dean at Regent Business School. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Neesa.
Morning. Thank you, Neesa. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Yes, so our topic for today is quite, we've got clever people who write catchy titles, Small Businesses, Big Problems, What Government Could Be Doing. I think the first thing I want to start off with was in every version of the budget 1, budget 2, budget 3 this year, there was vague references made to small business. There was the minister mentioned he wanted to remove, or there would be work towards removing the regulatory burden for small business, but there was nothing really concrete in terms of specific SME support programs or targeted relief measures or even funding initiatives. And I think that's part of where we came forward with deciding to do this webinar. Sorry. Also, the webinar is sponsored today by ABSA. Thank you so much for making it possible. And with that, Joshua, can we kick off with challenges that small businesses face when it comes to funding?
Sure. Thanks so much, Neesa. So we were also very interested and looking forward to seeing what would come out of the much anticipated versions of the budget. And I think we left with a similar feeling to you. We're not 100% sure yet what that's going to look like. I think there's recognition of the need to address what is a clear funding gap. I think SMMEs are so important because the stats show they still represent 40% of the country's GDP. And unemployment, which is still a very big topic of conversation, is around SMMEs. SMMEs contribute to 60% of the workforce. So obviously the stimulation financially of the SMMEs is what's going to really help address that unemployment gap that we've got in South Africa. From our side, our research, especially at a company like ours at Sourcefin, where we assist SMMEs every day, the reason that there's such a big funding gap, in our opinion, is that South Africa is quite unique in that its traditional financial institutions are very robust. They've got very, very, call it traditional credit decisioning. Traditionally, what that looks like is it's based on past track record. So what it looks at is things like your collateral, things like your trading history, but it's very much retrospective. The issue is that a lot of the SMMEs are very new. So there'll be companies that don't yet have a massive revenue. They need a forward-looking and open-minded approach. So the actual way in which credit decisioning is made in South Africa, especially in the traditional financial institutions, it doesn't lend itself to really assist SMMEs. And what it does is it creates a massive gap. And that's where there's this opportunity for many to go into and financial institutions to disrupt. But even with them doing so, there's still such a big need for government to really address it and look at ways in which they can collaborate, ideally maybe with some of the private institutions, and find ways that they can solve for that problem.
Thanks. Dr. Patel, do you have any ideas coming from the Regent Business School side of things? And obviously you're growing that next generation of entrepreneurs, we hope. What do you think of some of the government-backed loan guarantees or programs that could step into the breach?
Thanks, Neesa. Thanks, Josh, as well. I think that, what we're finding and what we're seeing when we talk to entrepreneurs on a daily basis, the issue is not really finance any longer. I think there's a shift and it's a mindset shift amongst entrepreneurs that says, I don't really need capital any longer or finance necessarily to launch a business. I need finance to scale a business. So there's a mindset shift amongst young entrepreneurs, and it's one that I think was necessary. It was overdue, actually, because in the past, historically, when you spoke to any entrepreneur, the first question is, well, I've got this great idea. How do I fund it? Where do I go to unlock funding? Where's the government support? Where's the private sector support? And like I say, the young generation is not looking at it that way. There's a couple of reasons why they're not looking at it that way. They're looking at it that way, number one, because of technology. Technology now allows you to launch a startup within minutes, quite literally. In fact, we had a masterclass last week where we launched a startup in under an hour. So that's number one. Number two, they recognize, young entrepreneurs are recognizing that there's a perceived lack of support from government agencies anyway, despite the fact that hundreds of government agencies from across different portfolios would lay claim to saying we support SMEs, we support micro entrepreneurs. We are in the startup business. But the issues that come about is, how does it practically become available? And if you look at it from the private sector, I beg your pardon, and Josh touched on it, banks and traditional finance houses are looking at credit worthiness, not investment worthiness. And an entrepreneur is not a business owner. There's a big difference between an entrepreneur and a business owner. A business owner, you can look at their credit worthiness, but an entrepreneur doesn't have a proven track record, and that's what Josh was alluding to. An entrepreneur is untested, fresh. So you need to, your risk appetite in funding that kind of individual has to be far bigger. And that's why I'm advocating, and I always do this. I advocate for institutions to look at an entrepreneur, not for their credit worthiness, but for the investment worthiness, the quality of ideas, the quality of conversation, the regularity with which one is prepared to fail. Failure has to be part and parcel of the decision-making as a positive in funding an entrepreneur. And so for me, that would be my sort of opening set of remarks in terms of how do entrepreneurs look to unlock funding.
Interesting. I was actually at an event in Joburg yesterday, and there was a small company there that was saying, they were talking about their challenges getting started. And one of the things they said was they got advice from somebody else in the industry, wiser, older, who said, just start. That's the best place. You know, instead of waiting for funding and waiting for the money to roll in and hoping and addressing all these finance issues, just start. And the funding has actually followed in that instance. Joshua, what do you think is some of the issues currently around compliance for business owners? I mean, the minister said talking about removing red tape and regulatory burden, but what are we looking at?
Sure. So I mean, if you place yourself in the position of an entrepreneur starting up, you face a lot of challenges in terms of even just opening a bank account. So you think of FICA, you think of the amount of documentation that you have to get through, right? That's just to set up a bank account, transactional. You haven't even yet applied for any form of credit. The majority of the financial institutions are going to ask you for things like your tax compliance. They're going to ask you for, annual financial statements, ideally audited. Firstly, like Dr. Patel is saying, you might not even have revenue. You might not even have those documents because you've just got an idea. You're not yet trading. Unfortunately, though, the way that it's set up is, as an entrepreneur, you need to fit into the products that the bank or that the credit institution has. They don't fit a product for you. They don't look to necessarily invest for you. So you're starting off where you've got a lot of documentations you need to get through. You need to be FICA. I know there's obviously a lot of room for anti-money laundering and all of these type of regulations, which I don't have an issue with, and I think they're necessary. However, we've got to find a way. I was thinking today, why do I have to FICA myself at 14 different financial institutions and start fresh every single time? Why is there not one repository, a central repository, where I FICA myself, the documentation are there, and it becomes available for all the institutions? Just to open something like a bank account, how can it take 7 business days? Dr. Patel just alluded to a startup that can get going within an hour. But then you're going to slow down because how you meant to actually operate without a transactional account. And then you go and apply for credit and it's weeks. So I think one of the issues definitely is we're very reliant on being heavy with documentation. We're still quite manual. I do like that there have been some new banks, without mentioning them, but there have been some new banks which have taken a different approach to this. They've made it available to open a bank account on your cell phone without actually going into a physical branch. And they've taken a new way of doing it. And I think that it has definitely assisted entrepreneurs. But we've got to find a good balance. You've got things like the National Credit Act, you've got the CPA, you've got the NCA, you've got all of these different regulations. And a lot of them are aimed actually at the smaller amounts. So if you look at the National Credit Act, where it has the most implication is actually at below 250,000 Rand in funding. Now, I understand protecting those amounts because maybe that's where people believe that there's the most vulnerability. But on the flip side, what you're doing is you're discouraging funders from actually entering the below 250,000 Rand space, because they're going to look at the legislation and say, if I advance loans above 250,000 Rand, I've got much more limited application of the National Credit Act. So what's incentivizing me to go and advance loans lower? I have to go and get a special license. I have to subject myself to audits. So we've got to balance, protection and regulation versus actually practicality and addressing that 350 billion rand funding gap. Because, being too heavy on it, all you're going to do is you're just going to broaden that gap.
Absolutely. Dr. Patel, in terms of, so Josh touched on a couple of issues there. I think one of the points we would look at is there's definitely opportunities for simplifying requirements for small businesses, like, for example, when it comes to tax filing. I think the FICA thing is necessary, Joshua, but you're quite right. There should be a central point where all our documents would be housed. Somebody actually told me that their bank told them that after 5 years, you've got a re-FICA. So it's not even a once-off process, regardless of whether you have to change addresses or not. Dr. Patel?
Yeah, Neesa, I think it's an interesting point around an ecosystem of funding. Or let me actually elevate the discussion. I think it's more than funding. I think it's an ecosystem of supporting SMMEs, micro enterprises, entrepreneurs, and anybody else that fits those kind of descriptors, right? So when I say an ecosystem, what do I really mean? And when I say I'm elevating it above finance, what do I mean? Josh is talking about FICA, and we talk a lot about mobile tech. So a lot of startups now are being launched on TikTok and on Instagram. It's really digital businesses that are being launched, right? So it's not only a FICA element, but it's also a RICA element. And if you've been following the news recently, which I'm sure you do because you run the news, you'd know that there's a lot of focus on the actual risks around RICA. And RICA itself has led to so many issues of identity theft, and in a context and a climate of human trafficking and the like, these are issues that we can't sidestep in the interest of saying, let's expand access or financial access to entrepreneurs. So Josh is right. We need to find this balance. How do you find that balance? For me, I think the departure point on finding that balance is for the government to try its best to step out of the way. And I know that sounds like it's a privatization agenda hidden behind, sort of this digital first, entrepreneurship first agenda, which is not the case. When I say government ought to step out of the way, what do I mean? The enabling environment for any business, entrepreneurship or otherwise, ought to be in place and be looked after by the government. Electricity supply, stable, clear regulation, understandable and accessible regulation, recourse for when things go wrong. Those are the enabling environment factors that I refer to that I think the government ought to be front and center on. So I'm not relegating the government or its agencies to any subordinate role. But when it comes to now the lower level, as I said, we elevated it. Now let's bring it down to a funding discussion. When it comes down to a funding discussion, how much of the money that the government is actually been putting forward for, as it says, to small and medium enterprise development, can they allocate a significant enough proportion to a private sector ecosystem or collaboration system that would administer those funds, that would look at what it means to be flexible in funding, what it means to be agile in funding, how do you respond to the needs and the changing needs of entrepreneurs on a daily basis, and do something about it. Because in the private sector, there's always this assumption, and often it proves to be true, it's more than just an assumption, that there's more agility in that private sector. So I would really advocate for that sort of blend and mix, almost in a private-public partnership, if you like, and looking at enabling an ecosystem of flourishing SMMEs and entrepreneurship.
Thank you. So you're talking about an ecosystem, and Josh, you're in that finance space. We've got two viewers, George and Danny, who are asking about, pooling resources. So George says, how do I know what help is offered? It's so tough out there. And if we're in Series B capital raise and we don't raise, we close. Is there something government can be doing to help that?
Sure, it's a good question. I think personally, what I would encourage is there are institutions like CIFA, for example, and a few others. There's also some institutions like FinFund, which aggregate and have different opportunities based on the funding you need. What I would say is the first step is understanding exactly what product you need and what suits you. So what I mean by that is you've got to make sure, and I think I find this to be a common mistake made by entrepreneurs. They say they need funding, but they don't necessarily understand what funding they need and what is going to work for them. they need to really do some research and look at what works in terms of what interest rate can I afford to take. What are my repayments like? Are these going to be monthly? Is it a milestone? Is it a term loan? Is it a revolving facility? Know what you're looking for, get your paperwork and your foundations correct, make sure, because you're going to need it. So if you can, you need to get your paperwork in order, get your financial statements ready, if you can do these things. And then when you go out to these meetings, you can answer these questions. But I think sometimes entrepreneurs aren't completely prepared for what they're looking for. But I think it is a great question, because it's not easy to find all of the available information on what you qualify for, where you go. I do think that CIFA would be my starting point in the scenario you gave, and then sort of see from there. Some of the government agencies are great at referring you to their counterparts, but it is a really good it is a big concern, and it's something we see a lot at SourceFin as well.
So just going back, thanks, Josh. Going back to the infrastructure point that you raised, Dr. Patel, I was really struck earlier this week. I bumped into a colleague of mine, Rebecca Davis, who's just been to the Ukraine in the last few weeks on a trip. And I said, well, Rebecca, how was it? What was it like? And her reply was, yes, it's war-torn. Yes, there were air siren raids going off all the time, but everything works. Even in a war-torn district like the Ukraine, where people are under fire all the time and there's bombs going off, all the infrastructure works, which I think is a huge indictment on South Africa. Dr. Patel, in terms of the curriculum at Regent Business School, is that something you consider when you're scaling up the next generation of entrepreneurs and business owners? Like, how do they address the serious infrastructure issues that they're going to face going forward?
Thanks, Neesa. Yeah, so I suppose let me answer the question as directly as I can. At Regent Business School, we've got a three-pronged approach to educating anything, and entrepreneurship being one of them, right? So one is the traditional, lectures, assignments, exams, that whole experience that we're all familiar with, that persists, and it will always persist because it's the nucleus of what we do. But having said that, we've got two other parts to our business that makes us what we think to be a contemporary education ecosystem. The second part is going to be the idea of an academic makerspace. We call it an iLead lab. What is it? It's actually a space where students can come into a safe physical environment and interact with the fourth industrial revolution. People often talk about it, but they've never seen it. It's very hard to describe what 4IR is. So we give our students an actual exposure in a safe environment, use it, break it, learn by doing. And so now let's just pull the picture together. You've learned all the so-called theoretical stuff in class. You've been examined on it. That's okay. Now you're getting a practical exposure to a lot of new technologies that you otherwise would not have had exposure to. And then the third leg is a focus on entrepreneurship. We call this unit the RED Hub, Regent Enterprise Development Hub. And what we do in there is we say that, listen, you now got the theory, you've got the practice, now you need to become employable. Not employed, but employable. That means you could go working for a company, but also can you become a job maker rather than a job taker? Okay. And now let's bring it into the infrastructure. I'll give you one or two examples to make you understand how we focus on the big issues, not just the small ones. We've got students in our Johannesburg campus who've launched technology for farming infrastructure, if you like. We've got a small, tiny computer that fits in the palm of your hand, and it can be programmed to set the right amount of water and fertilizer and anything else that a particular set of crops would need. And that is all done remotely at a cost of under 200 Rand. That's solving problems in farming that would otherwise have been dealt with through lots of hard work, toiling in the sun, lots of manual labor. So we're promoting this idea that you have a responsibility as a business school educated student to solve problems that's not part of your ecosystem, at least not on paper. So that's one example of infrastructure, right? The other one that we have in terms of infrastructure and the energy supply issue that we've all had issues with. Again, it's a practical example from students, is to say that, okay, we've got a lot of arable land in South Africa that we can use for farming. And again, but what's the byproduct of farming? There's a lot of energy. The land gives us energy. We get energy from the land. And we've got students who are now taking creative steps to take recycled waste from farming, from other industries, and using that to generate supply at scale. Now, I always caution that the goal is not scale. The goal is ideation. The goal is process of ideation. And if you follow a rigorous and sound process to ideate effectively and fail forward, and fail cheaply and fail quickly, then all the other stuff comes to you. You'll start to attract funding. You'll start to attract investors. You'll start to have the right quality conversations, as Josh was saying earlier, that says, I don't need to really go and do the research necessarily. Yes, you should do it, but you don't have to find out what the right product is, because the people will come with the right product to me. And if you have that base knowledge, you'll recognize that that is actually the right product that somebody's offering me. So yeah, infrastructure, very important, very interesting. And as a business school, we certainly prioritize that.
And Josh, in terms of access to finance and actually financing or accessing funding, is that something that you're seeing more of, where entrepreneurs and business owners are building that component into their funding and finance applications because it's a contingency issue, right?
Sure. I definitely am seeing it. I think, yeah, Dr. Patel's touched on quite a few like really pertinent points, but I think at the forefront of everything is we're moving in such a fast-paced world in business. If you look internationally, AI is changing the game, machine learning is changing the world. As South Africans, we've got to be very careful to not fall and lag behind. I think you've got to create a good environment for business to flourish. The cornerstone for that would be reliable infrastructure. It would be policy and government finding ways to sort of ensure that our SMMEs can keep up. And if we don't do so, even places like Ukraine that you mentioned during a war-torn situation, they've still got reliability in terms of their basic infrastructure, which we don't have. So yes, we may be not in a war situation, but unfortunately for entrepreneurs, it often does feel like you're in a war, because you imagine you are a small company that's a bakery, and you're so reliant on selling certain stock, paying your staff every month. If you have unforeseen things, whether it's water, whether it's power cuts, whether it's strikes, whatever it is, you can't be expected to flourish in that type of environment. It's so difficult, especially for businesses that are trading month to month, people that are working salary to salary. It's so difficult. So for me, like at the end of the day, we need to create all of these different products and make sure that we're working well on it. But I think I agree with Dr. Patel. You've got to create a stable, reliable infrastructure. You can obviously bridge public and private and make sure that that works. But at the cornerstone of everything, we need stability. We need entrepreneurs to understand that they can, have reliable access to information, to data that's not, one of the most expensive in the world, to electricity. Just basic things like that are so key for a business, and that can wipe out a business, no matter how good the idea is or the innovation or how gritty the entrepreneur is. Those are factors. Look at COVID, where businesses got absolutely wiped out by something beyond their control.
Wow, very interesting. So we've got a poll up on the website, in the group, in the chat. And in terms of, do you know where to go to access government support or funding for your business? 45% said they're not sure. Only 5% said yes, they know exactly where. 30% had a general idea, and 20% said, I didn't know support existed. Terrifying. And then we've got some questions coming through. So Amanda says, a lot of the agencies are not accessible to people in small towns. It costs money that entrepreneurs or business owners hardly have to travel to offices for assistance, which I assume, and I think from the picture that we're getting today, it's largely long to finance. It's not easy to just get the finance immediately. Josh?
Sure. No, I couldn't agree more. I think it's created something like our business at SourceFin. We've created something out of call it the disruption. Access is a massive one. We, for example, come across entrepreneurs who have an order for government or in the private sector, for over R1 million. But at the end of the day, they can't get started. They can't even afford necessarily to come to our offices. We would need to go and visit them, or we need to, pay for their flight to come and meet us. But the point is, we can work within that to make it work. And we have a forward-facing sort of view. I can understand that for people that don't know about the likes of SourceFin or whatever their product they're looking for is, it's so difficult, because there's so much that you need just to get started. And just like we've seen from the poll, so many people don't even know where to get started or where to go, who to speak to. So it's a real need. I mean, there's obviously an educational aspect here that we need to think about, but then logistically and from an infrastructure perspective, we need to make it more accessible. We need to find a way that we can deliver it to the people and that we can make it easier, and then start closing off that funding gap.
Sorry, so Lutik has a very good point. He mentions that I think it's a he. He mentions that many small businesses drowning on compliance from SARS to SIPSI to COIDA and UIF. And why is there so little movement towards a centralized digital compliance portal? Dr. Patel, do you have any ideas? How difficult would that be to actually implement?
Yeah, there's a cynical view that one could easily adopt on a question like that. And I'm going to try and resist the cynicism that a lot of South Africans might feel, right? But I'll touch on it anyway. The cynical view would be that it's not in the government's interest to do that, because there's so much of corruption going on in and around those sectors or those vehicles, that if you were to actually do the right thing, in inverted commas, and centralize everything, then there's less space for anybody to behave unethically. Let's phrase it that way. But like I said, that's a very cynical view, and I'm going to try and avert that as much as possible. If I were to take a more realistic view, a more positive view, I think it's quite easy to pull things together. The world we live in today is not short of technology, nor is it short of skills to pull very complicated things into appropriate systems, whether it be a single repository, whether that be a series of repositories, but where things are accessible, transparent, and so forth. That's not hard. I think the problem that we have is a product of and a function of the way that our government is set up. We've got national government, provincial government, local government. And there are certain things that the national government is responsible and accountable for, and they can do that. And then at the provincial level, there's something else, and the local level, there's something else. And when you consider the fact that despite the fact that we've created portfolios within our government and our cabinet and the various levels of government, because we have so many other things that our eye has to fall onto. We spoke about infrastructure, we can leave that to one side now. Issues of crime affecting businesses, and particularly small businesses. Issues of gender inequality. Issues of age inequality, racial inequality. All of these things are issues that face the entrepreneur of today, and it faces the agencies that are looking after the entrepreneurs today. And so in all of that, it's easy for one to say, well, okay, that's why we can't get to the single repository, because people are trying to work through many social issues, not just financial issues or economic issues. It's a series of social, political, and economic factors that are at play. Those, again, the cynicism can come back at different levels. Now you can start to say, well, there's no excuse. That still should be done and ought to be done. But my summary point, perhaps, Neesa, on this particular issue, I don't think it's hard to do. I think it can be done very quickly. I think it can be done very effectively. The challenge that we have is who in our government is going to take on that task and do it meaningfully. That's number one. And number two, can the government do it on its own? Is this, again, like we've been saying almost the entire session now, is this a case of the government needing private sector support? What would that support look like? And how would it actually impact the life of the entrepreneur?
I was just thinking the same thing, the private sector coming to the rescue again, as we've seen already in the logistics and the power supply sectors. Raymond has a good point. He says one of the reasons the informal sector is flourishing the way it is that they operate within a non-document, non-compliant sector. I think that is interesting. Joshua, do you ever have interactions with the informal sector? I think that it's a sector that's largely overlooked in the funding space.
So it is, and Raymond's comment's good, but I would almost just heed it by just giving him a point to say the problem with that, and I can understand where it's coming from. Maybe it's a bit tongue in cheek as well, but the problem is, in order to graduate and to grow bigger and move beyond the informal sector, if this isn't documented, taxes aren't paid, there's no record of these sales, etc., it becomes very, very difficult to take the next step. So the risk is that you become almost confined to the world of the informal sort of structure, and you'll never really graduate if that's the route that you go. which is an interesting conundrum in itself, and maybe a need for some policy changes around, sort of macro, some of the taxes, incentivizations that they could look at for employment and, post revenue, etc. But I think in terms of SourceFin itself, what we have recognized, and I'm pleased to say, there's a big shift in the, let's call them disruptive financial institutions like SourceFin, towards the informal sector. There's a big recognition around how much business is being done there. For a long time, the trade was done predominantly in actual cash, like hard cash, as opposed to being done through a point of sale machine. The issue with that is it becomes very difficult to track and very difficult to recover as a financial institution, because you have absolutely no idea how the company is trading. Post-COVID, there has been a big change. So because of COVID, contactless payment, and I think also financial literacy, people banking on their cell phones, there's been a massive shift in the last few years, where even in the informal settlements now, there are a lot more trade. And if you look at the Joburg market as an example, etc., there's a lot more trade now happening sort of in a way that can be documented and can really be tracked. So SourceFin is actually looking at some products there. We've been invited to participate into something in the Joburg market, which is very exciting. But I think in general, what I am pleased about is that area was almost one that financial institutions saw as a no-go. They knew there's a lot of business in the informal settlements and informal areas, but it was just seen as you can't really control it. It's too difficult. And what is positive is I have noticed, and I think you're going to see a lot more out of it, there's definitely a movement towards it. And I think it's definitely got a lot to do with the fact that now the point of sale machines, the Yoko devices, for example, they've become adopted and are much more of a common thing to see. So I think it's very good for the informal sector. And I think you're going to see more products and more companies positioning themselves in that direction.
Absolutely. Interesting. At the beginning, when you were talking about the informal sector, it almost sounds like there's a danger of becoming a victim of your own success, where you've built up the successful model in that environment, and now you've got to break into a formal environment. Desiree has a good point. She says many aspirant entrepreneurs have the skills and the artisanal wherewithal, but not necessarily the business acumen. Dr. Patel, what support is there for such entrepreneurs?
Short answer, a lot. But again, I think in many ways, like the previous, I think when you did the poll and a lot of people didn't know where to go to for funding or didn't know that there's funding available. I think you said 20% of people didn't know that there is support for funding of businesses, right? I think in many ways, the education piece probably follows a similar trajectory and graph. I'll talk about what I know. I know Region Business School very well. We promote entrepreneurship as a pathway to employability as a first and foremost priority. What does that mean? That means formal programs in and around entrepreneurship without removing the innate creativity that makes an entrepreneur what he or she ought to be. So we often what happens is people have great ideas, lots of innovative sort of approaches to solving big problems at scale and otherwise. But when you go to a formal education system, it kind of dulls that creativity and what made you the entrepreneur that you were. Because now you start to think in a particular series of boxes and that's all that you know. So we try and taper that. That's number one, formal accredited programs. Number two, we know that the value of being a lifelong learner is becoming ever so important. And we respond to that through a series of short learning programs, master classes, management development programs and the like, that says, depending on where you are in your entrepreneurship journey, you might be at the ideation phase, others might be a lot more mature. We try and offer a wide range of interventions that are quick, easy to learn, easy to absorb, easy to implement. And you might find that that's useful for you for 2 weeks or 2 months. And in that time, because the world changes so quickly, you need to refresh something else. So there's a whole new thing that you need to learn, and you come back, and that lifelong learning series of short learning programs becomes very valuable to an entrepreneur. So that's the two pieces that we try and do. I know that there's a lot of other institutions doing similar things, and I'm sure they're really good, but there is support. And then my next point on this issue, and it's an important one, entrepreneurs have to start understanding the value of mentorship. Their journey is always going to be inadequate if you just think you can do this thing on your own. And mentorship is not one person. You can't say, well, my business mentor said. it's a series of mentors that will help you in different things. One mentor might be helping you with funding. Another one will tell you, go and study something else. Another one will tell you, this is how you look at defining your market segment, and so forth and so forth. Without overcooking it, obviously, but you get the point, right? It's a multifaceted approach to mentorship. And I don't want to turn this into a lecture about what mentorship is, but there's another term called sponsorship. What is a sponsor? A sponsor is like a mentorship extraordinaire, who will not only help you with the issues that you have, but will fly your flag in meetings and in conversations that you are not present in, and will in that way promote you as an entrepreneur.
Absolutely. Colleen Pereira has a question. Maybe you can point her in the right direction, Joshua. She says she's a SAFA who's abroad right now, but she plans on returning to South Africa in the near future because she's realized we're the best country in the world. And she wants to know, what are her chances of getting support to set up a small business in this country? Where would she go for that support?
Sure. So I'm glad Colleen's coming back. I think she's correct. It is the best country in the world. I think in terms of being abroad and coming here, I don't think it's going to present her a massive challenge. But ultimately, it's exactly what we've been speaking about up until now. So what I would encourage is start already looking at what industry is this business that she's looking to open. In terms of registering a new business and getting it going, South Africa is actually not that difficult in terms of registration. So it's industry specific, but to set up, for example, a private company, it's something that can be done fairly easily on BizPortal or one of the other, government websites. The majority of SMMEs do operate under PTY Limited now. Obviously, CCs have been phased out. And PTY Limited, sole director, sole shareholder, that's really your backbone. To get that going isn't that difficult. Bank accounts are getting easier to link to it. But then once you're really getting going, I would say it's industry specific. So what support is available? You got to understand what you need for your industry. Do you need money because you are purchasing implements to start a business? Is it for leasing? Is it for employment? It's a difficult question to answer because it needs more context and specifics in terms of what she's looking for. But what I would say is just use the research, use AI, do what you can to get it set up, especially if she knows that she's coming already. There's no harm in setting the company up now. The challenge she's going to have is that she doesn't yet have a track record within that company. So there's going to be a credit search, for example, or a request for information on that company. And because it's a new company, it's not going to have that much of a track record. So that's going to be the challenge. But, there are ways to navigate around that. I think a lot of what we've been talking about now hopefully is applicable and can help direct her.
Absolutely. And then I'm going to throw a hot potato into the conversation at about halfway through the chat. Peter Ross wants to know, what is the view of the panel regarding the transformation fund being proposed by the DTI? The fund's main objective is to create support for existing and new small Black-owned businesses. Dr. Perciel, let's start with you, and then we'll throw the question back to Joshua so you both have a chance to address it.
Thanks, Neesa. I will address this question, or I'll respond to this question in the most broad terms possible. I think transformation in South Africa as a principle, as a concept, is a non-negotiable. I don't think it's in anybody's interest in this country to resist transformation of any kind, let alone in an entrepreneurship and small business discussion. The reasons for that are obvious, but I'll mention some of them anyway. Opportunity has been denied to many people and many different groups for many years and for many decades for many reasons. The time has now finally come for us to really and truly meaningfully address those in the most aggressive way possible. It cannot be lip service. It cannot be headlines that stay as headlines. It has to be where the rubber hits the proverbial road, that's where we need to feed it. So that's my first point. My second point, how we implement such a fund, how we administer such a fund is of critical importance. Not least because it's for the sake of good governance, but because of the issue that fund represents, which is transformation. And it should be at the forefront of every discussion. So for moral as well as for other reasons, the administration and implementation of that fund has to be sound. So that's my second point. My third point in this matter, and maybe it's a little bit more philosophical, I don't know. But for us to progress as an economy, for us to start shifting mindsets locally and globally as South African identity as a hub for entrepreneurship, we have to understand that it's not for a few. It's not for a select few. we can and should be exposing more people to an ecosystem of entrepreneurship that is based around transformation. So that's how I would respond to it. I'm in favor of it. I'm just cautious, and I'm cautioning that the implementation of such a fund must be sound and appropriate.
Thank you. Joshua?
Sure. So I echo so many of the sentiments that Dr. Patel said. In terms of the objective, I think I became aware of it sort of at the beginning of the year and started researching it. Obviously, when you see 100 billion rand fund being created by the DTRC, etc., it's going to pique interest. The objective, the purpose, financial inclusion, redressing some of the inequalities. I'm all for all of the above. My real question is, how are we going to do it? And that's where I've been struggling to get access to a lot of information around what is it going to look like? How is it going to be implemented, this fund? How do we make sure that the correct people are really receiving the funds? How's it going to work? For me, there are so many times that policies are coming out and they really have good objectives, things that really align with what we should be doing. But unfortunately, they let down due to implementation. And sometimes just genuinely, it can be down to fraud and corruption. And I'm really, really hoping that this is a different case. I need to really understand the implementation and look forward to seeing how it will be rolled out before I can properly comment. In terms of the objective, I think it's great. I think it makes sense. I think it is something that needs to be redressed. But I'm just concerned. 100 billion rand is a lot of money. I'm concerned about how it's going to be implemented. I hope I'm proven wrong. I hope it's very carefully rolled out. I hope the private sector is included in the decision making. Industry experts are brought in. It's very carefully rolled out and guarded, and it's fully transparent. These are things that I'm hoping will happen. But other than that, until we know more details, it's very, very hard to comment on it.
Okay. And then Nick wants to know, are we still going to mention what are the most burdensome regulations, and what smarter policies would you each propose to get around those burdensome regulations for SMMEs? Dr. Patel?
I think the biggest burden, Josh touched on it earlier, that it's a lot easier to register a company in today's time. But the perception amongst many entrepreneurs is it's this hard thing. It's incredibly difficult. So there's a perception and a reality, right? There's a perception that regulation is very cumbersome, and in parts they are. We'll talk about that. But there's a lot of change that has happened, and people don't fully realize that. So I think that the barrier to entry has been lowered quite significantly, and by the way, can continue to be lowered. I think where the issue comes in terms of difficulty around regulation, a lot of uncertainty around what the implications are from a tax perspective. People fear tax. People don't want to pay tax, I guess, but they don't understand the regulation around it because they fear it. They're too scared to engage the thing. They're too scared to find out more information, because if I find out more, I'm going to find myself vulnerable in my business or in my personal capacity. So there's an issue around tax. I think there's an issue around increasingly data protection. The POPIA Act, even Consumer Protection Act. There's a lot of uncertainty in the application in the mind of young entrepreneurs and early startup phase entrepreneurs, where they're too afraid to understand more about it, and so they live outside the law, if you like, or skirting the boundaries of the law. So those are the things that are difficult about it. As with any other law, whether that be in the business context or otherwise, translating legalese, as they like to say, into something that's more consumable and palatable for the lay person, and many entrepreneurs and SMMEs are lay in that sense, that's another barrier. So it's not just the fact that there's lots of laws and regulations that one needs to be aware of and familiar with and implement them and the like. It's also a case of what's happening in between the laws. Am I able to connect one law to another? Am I able to understand what the impact of the NCA is on the CPA? Am I able to understand how POPIA impacts on my ability to RICA and FICA when I'm working with the banks or the telecoms and so forth? So that entire regulatory landscape in and around entrepreneurship is one that will always be challenging, I guess. But the challenging part of it shouldn't be inhibiting. I think that would be my point.
Josh?
So I agree. with Dr. Patel in terms of establishing and incorporating a business. I think we're now at a point where doing so is not that difficult. Where I think that there's a lot of challenges is maintaining compliance in many ways. So an example of a new policy change is the UBO filing, so the ultimate beneficial owner. This is a record now that CIPC needs to keep. If you aren't able to adhere to that, you end up being deregistered. That will have an effect on multiple different things besides for just your credit score, but even just your status alone. But a lot of these things need to be embedded and incorporated, in my opinion, into one place. So what do I mean by that? You register a company. What is good, which I've noticed recently, is once you've registered a company, the portal, I think it's Biz Portal now, actually offers you bank account options. So you've created a company and they've actually partnered with the banks to then, at the next step say to you, do you need a bank account? And you're getting your offerings, which is great. But now what about VAT? So firstly, who knows if they have to be a VAT vendor or not? And I think Dr. Patel in the Regent School is going to give a lot of entrepreneurs and, budding businessmen and women the opportunity to learn about this. But a lot of people don't know that you have to mandatorily register to be a VAT vendor once your turnover hits a million rand or more, for example. Or what are the benefits of being a VAT vendor versus not doing so, especially in terms of scaling. So I think the big issue is there needs to be this maintenance, this ongoing thing. In terms of policy, well, a lot of it's industry specific. So when you look at industries like the fuel business, I've seen personally from clients that source funds, it's very difficult to get a fuel license to actually be a proper trader in fuel. Now, the problem with that is by making it so difficult, you're encouraging people to operate outside of the confines of the law. So people are still finding a way to go and deliver and purchase wholesale fuel without a proper license, which is a big problem. So there are industry specific areas where I think it's very, very hard to get into and to properly operate. But as a whole, my big drive would be I would look at ways to make it more user-friendly and understandable to maintain your business status, maintain your filing of your financials. And your financials don't have to be audited. There's a misconception. You can volunteer to not make it mandatory to do so, and below a certain threshold, that's fine. So I think a lot of people get very nervous about filing and what does that mean for me and what is the tax implication and are SARS going to come after me. I think we've just got to make it a lot easier, transparent, have one portal that can explain all of these different offerings and partner with private to actually go and offer them just like the bank accounts.
And then Tankiso had an interesting point. He says it's difficult to do business with government because before you start a project where you want to do business with government, they require a business guarantee, and there are no institutions that help with this, not even the banks. Joshua, do you know what he's talking about? What is a business guarantee? Who gives you this?
I know exactly what he's talking about, and I'm actually willing to listen and tell you more about it, but also play devil's advocate on it. So essentially, when the government issue out a contract, there's a set of rules that prescribes the public procurement and how that works. But once the beneficiary of a contract is awarded, one of the conditions to ensure that they can fulfill their obligations under the contract is to provide the government with some sort of guarantee. So, for example, let's talk about if somebody had a road project with the government, an infrastructure deal to build a road. The government's risk is that they award it to Neesa, but Neesa isn't actually going to be able to perform and build the road. So what's that going to do? It's going to impact service delivery. Neesa's not going to start a project. So what they receive is something called a performance guarantee, sometimes called a bank guarantee. But essentially what it's doing is it's ensuring the underlying obligation that should the government have an issue, whether it's with the build, whether it's the quality, whether it's performance delays, etc., there's an extra person, an extra institution they can go to claim. So it is important for government to have it, because otherwise we're going to be left with many half-built roads and bridges and things like that. The problem is there aren't a lot of institutions very similar to funding where they are willing to provide this because they're worried about whether that SMME is going to be able to actually perform the underlying project. So there are 2 or 3 big institutions that do it, but it's very similar to the funding problem. And where SourceFin comes in, we very similar to this, except ours is more on the funding side. So we found the same problem. Government was issuing out orders to SMMEs, really lucrative and good contracts. But the banks and the traditional institutions are not interested in funding those people because the scorecard for funding is a completely different scorecard, which, the public Procurement Act would go and use to award. And that's where our company sort of came into bridge to say, we actually can take a forward-looking approach. So hopefully there will be more institutions that take a similar view to source fins and have a forward-looking approach that really look at the customer and say, these guys will be able to perform under the contract. But I do see the government side in this. We're very quick to point out that there's lack of service delivery and why did this contractor get that deal? The government needs some sort of recourse in those institutions where contractors left something half built and their damages, and the government need to go out and re-tender. They need to have something like a guarantee in place where they can actually go and recoup the money that they paid.
Absolutely. Raymond has another good point. He says, and he's saying that big businesses, well, Danny says, big businesses like corporates should mentor and coach smaller business entrepreneurs, which would be, in an ideal world, a great thing to see more of. I suspect that it is going on behind the scenes, but maybe it's just not talked about as much as it should be. And I think the problem is that a lot of the entrepreneurs or small businesses actually don't know where to go. So Raymond says all JSE listed companies and executives should be donating a certain amount of hours per month, similar to CPD hours that you have to log every month. Dr. Patel, do you see steps being made in this direction?
I like the premise behind the idea, but I just want to sort of contrast that with the following. Entrepreneurs should not make the mistake they're thinking an executive in a corporate at the JSE or anywhere else is the best person to mentor me in entrepreneurship. They have a different skill set. They've got a different set of objectives. They might be in business, yes, and they might have valuable advice to provide you, but it's that same thing where I said you need multiple mentors, right? To me, an entrepreneur is the best person to mentor and advise an entrepreneur. The people who work in boardrooms have not seen the challenges of an entrepreneur perhaps ever. So I'm not saying don't talk to them. I'm not saying they shouldn't talk to you. I'm not saying they shouldn't be dedicating X amount of time to helping others. But I'm just cautioning that should not be the primary source of information for an entrepreneur. That's my first point. My second point is around this idea of business incubations or incubators. I know of many corporates, listed and otherwise, that have got their own version of an incubator. They might have different reasons for why they've launched incubators. And they say, well, you know what, we want to get people into and through this incubator and the like. But people misunderstand what an incubator is. We use terms sometimes in and around entrepreneurship that it's so loose, and we need to be a bit more tighter in the way we think about things. And to explain an incubator in like a minute, when a child is born and the child needs help in a hospital to survive on their own, they get placed into an incubator. It's a box where, like, whatever lighting and oxygen, whatever else is provided to help that child grow, that baby. And once it's ready, once it's now got to a point of growth and development that it can perhaps survive a little bit on its own, it leaves the incubator. That example, it rings true in an entrepreneurship discussion. So when you incubate a business, that business is not ready to breathe on its own yet. It's there, it's living, it's a thing, but it needs a lot of support and a lot of help. It's not just the mentorship in an incubator. It's not just, oh, go and speak to so-and-so for funding. It's about keeping that thing alive, and whatever that means would be different depending on the situation. And when that business is ready to breathe and live on its own, that can leave the incubator. Now, why am I mentioning this in response to the mentorship question? Because corporates often fall into the trap of thinking that because I've got an incubator and somebody comes and asks me as an executive for help, I'm going to refer you to my incubator. It's almost a deference towards the incubator. So guarding against that, getting the right quality of conversation with the right people at the right time is very important for that kind of discussion.
Absolutely. Sanchia says she is a business mentor, but she says, I'm not sure, somebody can't afford to pay her, and that's where government and private sector comes in. But there's red tape for mentors to get financial support to help entrepreneurs, which is an interesting observation. I can't believe it, but we've actually got less than 10 minutes left. It feels like we've just barely started scratching the surface, and there's still so much to be said. And I can see from the engagement that viewers are also very interested. So unfortunately, we're going to have to round up for today. Thanks again to ABSA for sponsoring this webinar and making it possible. Josh and Dr. Patel, would you each like to just take a turn to give some closing remarks?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. And one of the things maybe to touch on, and I did have a look on it, we just didn't have the time to touch into it. But I was looking at potential ways in which I thought maybe the government could assist, especially when it comes to programs that would be effective looking outside of South Africa. And I came across a really interesting study in Singapore. So Singapore, as you'll know, really thriving economy, country, which 40, 50, 60 years ago really wasn't there. And they've done amazing things in such a short time. And I was really curious how they've managed to incubate and get these startups funding, etc. Obviously, a different climate to South Africa, but I still think there are lessons to learn. And what I found amazing and would really love and challenge the concept of this locally, they've created ways that they think could tackle the lack of interest for an investor to put money into a startup. So what have they done? They've created tax incentives, both for the investor and for the startup. In terms of the investor, there's no CGT. So there's no capital gain on their investment should they hold those shares in the startup and it later becomes something much more valuable that they dispose of. It's absolutely CGT free, provided that the investment came in at an early stage. The other thing is that the early revenue of that company, the first, and I think it's $250,000 or $100,000, there's no tax whatsoever on that taxable income. So they're allowing that startup to not have to have that tax leakage. Obviously, there can be problems in terms of companies abusing that, but there's definitely very good positives. There's also grants where they do a matching with private. So if SourceFin, for example, were to go and put in a 500,000 Rand investment into an agricultural startup, the government will go and match that 500,000 Rand. And in a Series B, for example, or Series C or down the line, they then start going from maybe 100% to 75% to 50%. But what they're doing is they're incentivizing, because I know as an investor, my 500,000 Rand is now actually unlocking R1 million for that investment company because of the government matching it. And I know I'm getting a tax break, both personally from a CGT perspective, as well as for my investment company. So I think there's a lot of very clever schemes that we can think of where we don't just run to the government for a loan that we never repay. Unfortunately, South Africans do have this concept that the government owe it to them to give them money, and there's not always a repayment scheme there. So that's why a lot of these government funders, without naming them, but a lot of them SourceFin have worked closely with, unfortunately, they feel that once they lend money to an SMME, there's just no recourse. There's no reason to repay. I'm saying let's find a way that we can, partner with private, co-invest with private, leverage off all the good things that the private equity companies in South Africa are doing, and then make sure that you're getting that capital back. And I'm happy for government to grow as well. Let them get the upside in this. So I think we can learn a lot from countries like Singapore, and look if we can adopt some of that mindset in South Africa. I'd love to see it.
Absolutely. Some great points there, Josh. Dr. Patel?
Thanks, Neesa. I fully endorse Josh's sentiments. My closing remarks would be, as mentioned earlier, a mindset shift has seemingly taken place from young entrepreneurs that said, finance is not the first thing I need to worry about. I need to worry about the quality of my idea. Maybe there's another mindset shift that's required in the way we look at regulation. Can we start getting entrepreneurs to stop looking at regulation as an inhibitor and rather as an enabler? I think that would really help to declutter and demystify a lot of the challenges in and around the issue of regulation, which we spoke about at length. Number two, the role definition of government and the public-private partnership thing is going to have to continue to grow. Again, I'm going to re-emphasize my view. I think that the government should be creating the enabling environment and almost relying on the private sector to plug the gaps that it has tried to do for a long, long time and hasn't been successful. Summary point on that, government should try and stay out of the way as far as possible in that regard. My final point is around education, getting knowledge, different kinds of knowledge, embracing and almost becoming obsessive around being a lifelong learner, irrespective of what industry you're operating in, irrespective of your stage of maturity in your business. Understanding the value of education and how it can promote you. Formal, informal, and mentorship education opportunities are really going to stand you in good stead as an entrepreneur to be successful over the long term.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to end off by saying that we ran 2 polls in the chat during the course of this webinar, and the needle definitely shifted from the beginning of the webinar to the end of the webinar, where more than 54% said yes, they feel much more informed after this discussion and conversation. So on that point, I really have to say thank you so much to Josh Kadish and Dr. Shaheen Patel from Regent Business School and SourceFin for joining us and bringing so much richness and depth to this really important conversation. And thanks again to ABSA for sponsoring us. And I think we've definitely got some great footage here that we can expand on and perhaps roll out to further webinars. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Neesa. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.